Hey guys, Joy here. In this video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about CSS grids. I have divided the entire grid properties into two sections: parent properties, children properties. Okay? By the way, this entire video is divided into chapters. Timestamps are given on the description down below so that you can access any property at any moment you want. First of all, we're going to discuss about the parent properties, starting with the grid architecture, and then we're going to discuss about these properties, and then this red color text over here are shorthands. Okay, don't worry about this. I'm going to discuss in details about these shorthands. First of all, I'm going to discuss the longhand and then the shorthands. Okay, but wait a minute boys, I have created an entire cheat sheet on grids. I'm pretty excited about this. Link of this article is given in the description down below. Go and check it out boys. Alright then, out of the box you can see a table of contents over here. I have arranged all the properties over here so that you can access any property at any moment you want. Starting with the grid architecture. This is basically an illustration of what you can do with grids. And then we have the grid template columns. Over here I have used illustrations along with code snippets over here so that you can better understand how each code snippet works. For instance, you can see this property over here, which is the grid template columns. So what happens when you have three inputs? This one, and this one. Alright? I have used colors, red, green, black, to illustrate the results over here. The same thing applies for all the other properties like this one, the grid template rows. You can see what happens when you input these numbers over here through these illustrations over here. Alright? And this is the grid template areas. You can see I have used various colors along with code snippets over here. You can see that in order to create this one, you can see the color red. Okay, so on the code you can see the color red. Okay, and then if you want to create this too, which is green and purple, you can see that by using these codes and this one you can create this layout over here. Don't worry, I'm gonna discuss them in details in the video. Okay, now let me give you another example with column gaps. Okay, so what happens when we give the column gap of 50 pixels? Now you can see how 50 pixels is equally distributed among the grid columns through the grid line. So these are pretty much our properties over here. These are the parent properties, and then we're gonna discuss about the children properties over here. You can go through them. If you're new to the channel, feel free to subscribe because I post videos based on practical web dev projects so that you can level up your coding skills. If that sounds interesting, hit the subscribe button and join my gang. And without further ado, let's get started. Alright boys, before coding we need to set up our environment. So come over to codepen.io or any code editor, and over here on the HTML section you write .container. Then hit tab. Alright, and inside over here we're gonna create three boxes. So along the video we can either increase our boxes or decrease our boxes in order to explain the grid properties. Okay, so over here we're gonna write .box *3. Okay, and over here we write 1, 2, 3 like that, and over here write A, B and C. So we are pretty much done with the HTML. For this tutorial I'm gonna use plain CSS, no preprocessors. Okay, so over here first of all we need to remove the default styles. In order to do that, hit star curly braces and set the margin and padding to 0 pixels each. Okay, M0px tab, P0px tab, and box sizing set it to border box like this. Okay, you write BOBO and tap. See, shortcut, magic. Alright, while using the plain CSS we don't have any nesting functions. That's why we have to write it outside. So write body, we need to change the font size and the font family. Okay, do it. FF tap. Okay, and then SS tap. Magic. Okay then, over here set the font size to 40 pixels so that we can better understand and better see what we are trying to do. Alright, and now we're gonna set the width to 100% like this, W 100%. Alright, hit tap like this, and minimum height 100 VH like this boys, height 100 VH like that. We're 50% done over here. We can minimize it like this. Now we're gonna target all the boxes and style them together. In order to do that, write square brackets class power sign equal to like this and double quotes, and write box hyphen. Okay, set the background color to sky blue, BGC tab sky blue like this. It looks quite ugly and pretty hard to differentiate. In order to separate them, we can use some gaps, okay? So over here you write dot container like this, and then we're gonna write gap 20 pixels like this, and you can see that it's not working. That's because it is a property that belongs to the grid. In order to trigger the grid, you need to write display grid and then it is gonna work, okay? Don't worry about this. I'm gonna discuss this gap property in details along the video. So write d grid and hit tab. You can see now it's working perfectly fine. Next up, we need to place this text at the very center. Okay, in order to do that, you write d grid. That's basically triggering the grid. And then we can access its properties. Okay, you write place items, which is basically a shorthand for justify items and align items. Okay, so on the syllabus we can see it. So this is the shorthand of these two items. Okay, don't panic, I'm gonna discuss about this. Okay, for now, place items is a shorthand of two properties. You write center like this, and now it's at the center both horizontally and vertically. Alright boys, we're done with our setup. Now back to our syllabus. Over here we're gonna start with the grid architecture. Now back to the cheat sheet. The first thing is the grid architecture. If you can recall Flexbox, by the way, this is a part of the cheat sheet I made for Flexbox. Link is given in the description down below. Go and check it out. Flexbox gave us two options. Either we work with rows or we work with columns, which is flex direction row or flex direction column, something like this. Over here we can see it. So we have the flex direction row, which is this one, or we had to work with flex direction column. But on the grid model, we can work with both rows and columns at the same time out of the box. Over here we have the rows and columns. For this tutorial, just remember that this horizontal line is the x-axis and this vertical line is the y-axis. Okay, so let's see how to count the rows and columns. This is our column number 1, column number 2, and this one is column number 3. And on the rows we count it like 1, 2 and 3. So this is a 3 by 3 layout. One cool feature of using the grid model is that you can combine multiple columns and you can also combine multiple rows, just like Microsoft spreadsheet, into a single cell. We're going to discuss about that in details when we are discussing about these properties over here, the grid template start by end and the grid row start by end. So we are pretty much done with the grid architecture. The main purpose of building this cheat sheet is for you to revise your grid knowledge very easily, efficiently and quickly. Now we're gonna start discussing about the grid template columns. Now back to the cheat sheet, you can find this property over here. At first I'm gonna discuss the theory using this illustration over here, and then we're gonna go to CodePen and write some code so that I can give you some practical knowledge about this property. Alright, now the main theory behind using grid template columns is to create the number of columns, at the same time give width of each of those columns. The more inputs we have, the more columns will we have. Count with me, how many inputs do we have? Okay, this is 1, this is 2 and this is 3. So we have 3 inputs. Now count with me, how many columns do we have? We have 1, 2 and then 3. You basically got the idea what grid template column does. And now the second point, it is used to set the width of each column. You can see that the first input is 200 pixels, which means that the first column will be 200 pixels. The next one is auto. The last one is 100 pixels, which is this one over here. And what is the auto doing? The auto is trying to cover the remaining spaces inside our width. So we are pretty much done with the theory. Let's go to CodePen. Now the grid template column is a parent property, which means that we have to write our code over here inside the container over here. So we're gonna write grid template column, here is it, columns. Okay, and now according to the theory, the more inputs you have, the more columns will you have. For instance, if I write the first input as 100 pixels, let's see what happens. You can see that I have just one column over here which is 100 pixels. Now what will happen if I write 300 pixels over here? Let's see. Okay, so we have the B, which is 300 pixels. So this is our first column, this is our second column over here. This one is 100 pixels and this is 300 pixels. Now let's write auto, okay, A-U-T-O, like this, and you can see that C is filling up the remaining spaces. Now what will happen? If I try to resize the window? Let's see. You can see that C is actually trying to expand and squeeze, but A and B are exactly fixed. That's because we have given an exact measurement. For A, I mean the column number 1 is gonna be 100 pixels and the second column, which is B, is gonna be 300 pixels, and auto will be set to C, which means that it can grow and shrink according to the available space of our screen. Now what will happen if we have more than 3 inputs? Let's say we have 200 pixels over here, okay? Now we can see that if I resize the window, the C is expanding, and also if I resize it again, it's shrinking, but we have some extra gap over here which is not filled. That's because we have 3 boxes and we have 4 columns. The name itself, grid template column, is self-explanatory. It works like a blueprint, okay? So we have 3 boxes. What will happen? Now let's increase one more box, okay? Come to the HTML over here, and over here you write .box for tab and write D. Now let's see what happened. If you resize the window, we can see we have a D which is 200 pixels. As we set it over here, the last one is 200 pixels and the C is auto. So you can see that C will squeeze and shrink, okay? And D is on its exact measurement, B is 300 pixels, D is 200 pixels, and A is 100 pixels, okay? So let's see again. Alright, so we are done with the grid template columns. Let's start grid template rows, which is pretty much same like the columns, it just works with the rows, okay? The columns were working on the x-axis and the rows works on the y-axis, alright? On the cheat sheet you can see that it's pretty much same like grid template columns. Okay, so these are our inputs over here, and these are the results. You can skim through it. Now back to our code pen, we remove this line of code over here, okay, and we're gonna start with grid template rows. Grid template rows over here. Alright, it works pretty much the same as the previous property. In this case, it is used to create number of rows and then set the height of each rows. Something like this. Let me show you. First of all, if I set the value 100 pixels, let's see what happens. You can see that the first row, this is row number 1, the second row, third row and fourth row, okay? You can see that row number 1 is 100 pixels. Now let's see what happens if I set it to 300 pixels like this. You can see the B is 300 pixels, okay? Let's set C to auto and see what happens. If you write auto over here, now you can see that the third row is not working when I set it to auto. Why is that? That's because you have to set the height of our container. So come over here and you write height, set it to 100 VH, which is basically the whole thing. Now it's gonna work. And then on the last one, if you want to set it to, let's say 30 pixels, let's see what happens. You can see that the D is 30 pixels. Or let's actually increase its height a little bit more so that we can actually see. Let's set it to 80 pixels like this. And you can see that A is 100 pixels, B is 300 pixels, C is auto, which is basically if you resize the window, it's gonna take the available space. And the D is 80 pixels over here. That's pretty much grid template rows. In order to discuss about the grid template areas, we also need to discuss about grid areas because these two properties work with each other. Otherwise, you can't get the result. We're basically gonna recreate this layout over here. By the way, that layout is actually a part of this video where I discuss about how to create layouts using grid. Okay, so this is the level 1 over here, and then on level 2 we build this layout, and on level 3 we build this, which is actually the one that is we're gonna make right now. Okay, the cool feature of this video is that we have 2 designs for each level, for the desktop version and another one for the mobile version, and then we have the level 4. And you can also check the level 5 over here. Link of this video is given in the description down below. Go and check it out. Alright then, let's talk about the main benefit of using grid template areas instead of using grid template columns and grid template rows. So when you are making columns and rows using the grid template columns, grid template rows, you might get lost. But by using grid template areas, you can visually see what you're trying to do. And by that, you won't get lost. Let me show you. Now, back to our code editor. We're gonna keep this code, okay? And we're gonna have 3 boxes, okay? Box 1, box 2, box 3. It will carry A, B and C, alright? And over here, we don't need to change anything on the CSS, just keep these properties, okay? Dot container, display grid, height 100 VH, grid gap of 20 pixels, alright? And remove everything else. Now, let's start writing grid template areas, alright? Then double quotes over here and then semicolon. Now, we're going to individually target box 1, box 2 and box 3 like this. Dot box1. Now we're going to make the blueprint. Now back to our design, we want A to cover everything from the left to the right. In order to do that, let's divide the entire width into 12 columns. Okay? On CodePen, in order to represent 12 columns, we're going to write A 12 times. Let me show you how to do that. We write A and then give a space over here, otherwise it's not gonna work. Okay, A and A. Okay, don't write like this. Okay, no, it's a big cross. Okay, give space at the middle like this. Okay, I like to keep a big gap after 4 letters. This 4 letters over here represents 4 columns. All right. And let's give a big gap over here, and then we're gonna make 4 more letters which will represent 4 more columns like this. A space, A space, A space. All right, then another big space, and then write 4 more times A, which will represent 4 more columns like this. A and A. All right, in order to assign A on the box 1, we simply write over here grid area and then write capital letter A. That's because this one is capital letter A, okay? And then you can see that it's automatically assigned over here. For B, we want it to carry 10 columns, alright? In order to do that, we're gonna write B 10 times. And for C, we want it to carry 2 columns. And for that, we're gonna write C 2 times. Now back to our CodePen editor, remove the semicolon over here and give double quotes below and put the semicolon over here again and write B 10 times. How many times? 10 times. That's because on our design we want it to carry this much amount of space. Alright. Now back to CodePen, write B 10 times. B space, B space, B space, B. These 4 letters will represent 4 columns. Okay. Now give a big space like this and write B 4 more times. B space, B space, B space, B. And then we have to write B 2 more times, which will represent 2 more columns. Okay. So in total, we have written B 10 times. B, B. And this 10B will represent 10 columns. Now let's assign B to box 2. In order to do that, come over here and write grid area and write B. You can see that it's not working. That's because we have some gaps over here. We have to fill that gap. So in order to fill that gap, if you can recall, I also told you that we also need C to cover 2 columns. Alright. So over here, write C space C. Now it's working perfectly fine. You can see that. And for C, we want it to expand, but it isn't expanding. That's because we also need to assign C to box 3. Like this, let me show you. Grid area, write C over here like this, and it's gonna work right now. We can see that we have 2 rows and both of them are equal to one another. This is 50%, this is 50%. But if you want to make it exactly like the design over here, what you can do is you can just copy it again and then paste it over here again. Let me show you. Alright, and just remove the semicolon over here. That's because we just need 1 semicolon to end our property. Control A, Shift, Tab, and it's gonna automatically align our code. Right now, let's compare our code with our design. Alright, you can see that over here we have 12 columns. Count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We have how many columns? 12 columns. And then we have joined the columns together. For A, and then we have given B 10 columns and C 2 columns. But you might ask me a question that we're gonna use 12 rows, but why is there just 3 rows? 1, 2, and then 3. Why is there just 3 rows? Well, you can also use the ratio. So this is the first row over here, and this is the second row. Okay? This is a single line of code, and this is 2 lines of code over here, which means that it is 1:2. For every 1 row at the top, we're gonna have 2 rows at the bottom. For every 2 rows at the top, we're gonna have double at the bottom, which is 4 rows. Okay? For every 4 rows over here, we're gonna have 8 rows at the bottom, which is basically this one. Okay? If you divide 4 by 8, it's gonna be 1/2 or 1:2, the ratio. I hope you understood it. Now let's discuss about the grid template. This is a shorthand for the grid template column and the grid template rows over here. Alright, so first of all you have to write the rows, and then you have to give a slash, and then you have to write columns. Let me show you. Alright, back to our code pen. These are the properties inside the parent container. Over here we're gonna write grid template. Let's increase another box. Come over here and you write box 4 and then D dot box 4 tab and write D. Now we're gonna make a 2x2 layout. 2x2 layout means 2 columns, 2 rows. Okay, let me show you. First of all, you have to input rows and then columns. Let me show you. Let's say for the first row we want it to be 100 pixels. You write 100 pixels like this. And for the second row, let's say you want it to be 200 pixels. Okay, so 200 pixels like this, and then you have to give a slash like this. Okay, and then let's say you want the first column to be let's say for the first column you want it to be 200 pixels. Okay, so write 200 pixels, and for the second column you want it to be 400 pixels. Okay, so write 400 pixels like this. And you can see first row is how much? 100 pixels. The second row is 200 pixels. Okay, so this one represents this. Okay, and this 200 pixels represents this one. At the same time, these 2 values over here represents the columns. The first column is 200 pixels and the second column is 400 pixels. You can clearly see that. You can also use the repeat function over here. So instead of doing this, you can write repeat. You can write 2 over here. That is because we want 2 rows. Okay, and let's say 1fr. You can pretty much use any value you want. And then over here, instead of writing this, we can use the repeat function as well. Repeat 2 1fr like this, and we're pretty much done with our 2x2 layout. You can also change the values as you like. But wait a minute, rows aren't working. Why is that? That's because we have to set the height to 100 VH, otherwise it's not gonna work. Like this, let me show you. Height, you can see this one. Okay, it's not working. So you write 100 VX. Now it's working perfectly fine. So we're pretty much done with grid templates. Let's start discussing about the column and row gaps. And then we're going to discuss about the shorthand. Okay. Now back to our code. Let's remove this gap property over here and let's keep everything as it is. Okay. Now you can see that everything is fulfilled. There is no gap. There is no space. Okay. So the column gap is used to put gap between columns. Okay. This is my first column. This is my second column. Okay. If you want to create some gap between them, you write over here column gap like this. Let me show you. Over here, let's set the gap to be, let's say, 50 pixels and let's see what happens. You can see that we have a gap between our columns. Okay. Now back to our cheat sheet, we have something called the grid line. This is actually the grid line, which is an invisible line between columns. So when we are setting column gap to 50 pixels, what happens is that this 50 pixels is actually divided between the left and on the right of our grid line. Something like this on the illustration you can see. The same rule is applicable for the row gap as well. Alright, column gap is used to set gap between columns and row gap is used to set gap between rows. Okay, so write row gap over here and set it to, let's say, 150 pixels. Over here you can see that the gap between columns are 50 pixels and the gap between rows are 150 pixels. The grid gap or the gap is pretty much the same thing, just the version difference. Let me show you. Also, it is a shorthand for the column and row gap. Let me show you. Over here, if you write gap, let's say it's 40 pixels. You can see that the gap between columns are 40 pixels and the gap between rows are 40 pixels as well, which now the grid gap is pretty much the same, just it's an old version. This gap is the new version and the grid gap is the old version. Okay, so if you think that the gap isn't working on a specific browser, you can try using grid gap. It might help. Alright then, now let's discuss justify items. You might get confused by these 4 items over here. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm discussing justify content and justify items together. First, let's see justify items and then we're gonna see justify content and then we're gonna differentiate and then we're gonna compare between these two. Okay? First things first, justify items works on the x-axis. Okay? And then you can see that we have the column over here and the column over here as well. This is column number 1 and the column number 2. You can see that the content inside it is actually moving back and forth. To explain this, let's come back to CodePen. Now instead of using the 1FR unit, let's set it to 100 pixels. Okay, 100 pixels and 100 pixels. And instead of the grid gap to be 40, let's set it to 20 pixels. Okay, I changed my mind, set it to 200 pixels, 2, and then over here 2 as well. And over here at the bottom, write justify items. Okay, and leave it blank for now. Alright, let me resize it over here so that you can better understand. So this is the property over here. I'm gonna change here. Okay, and now look at my mouse. Now what are our main contents over here? We have the A, B, C and D. So when I use the justify items, it's gonna move my letters back and forth. Let me show you. So are you seeing my mouse on the screen? I'm putting it at the grid gap over here. Okay, I'm not gonna move it. Okay, so when I use justify items start, you can see that the gap is over there. My mouse is over there, but the content from being at the center went to the very left. And now let's change it to end and let's see what happens. Okay, E and D. You can see that my mouse is at the same position, the gap is at the same position, nothing changed except the letters. You can see that from being at the very left, it went to the very right. Now let's change it to center. You can see that the letter has gone to the very center. And let's try stretch. From these 4 values, what I'm trying to tell you is by using justify items, you can move grid items inside the column. Okay? But by using justify content, you can move grid items along the grid parent. Let me show you. So at the very bottom, let's write justify content and let's start with start. Nothing changes, that's because it is already at the start position. But if I write it end over here, you can see that all the boxes has moved to the very right. But what happens if I write center? I hope you got the difference between justify items and justify contents. By using justify items, you can move this letter along the column. Okay, so this is the column start, this is the column end. Okay, this is the start, this is the end. So by using justify items, you can move the letters here, here and at the very center and also stretch. But by using justify content, you can move the whole thing back and forth. Now you might have a question back there when I was using justify items. So when I use start or end or center, you can see these types of behavior, start. Like this, you can see that our box has shrunk. Why is that? You can see that the box is occupying maximum amount of space A can hold. Let me give you another example. The letter I doesn't hold equal amount of space as the letter G. G is obviously bigger than the I. On HTML, let me show you. So come over here and instead of C, write G, and instead of the D, write I. Now on the code, you can see that G is occupying more space than A and B, and I is occupying less space. That's because the amount of space these letters can carry. I hope you understand why our boxes shrunk. That's because of the content it is carrying. Let's put it back as it was before, like this. Now by using justify content, you can do a lot of works. On the cheat sheet, if you come to the justify content section, you can see what you can do. You can see that the justify content works on the x-axis, alright? And by using this property, you can basically move everything back and forth, just like that we did earlier on CodePen. Other than these 4 values, we have 3 more values which we can do. So over here, you can see that we have space between, space around, and space evenly. Also, I have illustrated the difference between these 3 values over here. You can definitely go and check it out. So we are done with justify items, justify contents. Now let's discuss about the align items and align content, which is pretty much the same as these two, but these two properties works on the y-axis. Okay, let me show you. Now back to the cheat sheet. This is what you can do with align items, but still let me show you it on code. Now back to the CodePen. We don't need this two over here. Let's delete it, and over here we're gonna write align items. For this tutorial, I'm gonna put my mouse over here, okay, and see what happens when I write start. Oh, sorry. You can see that the gap is over there. My mouse is over there, but the content has shifted to the very top. What happens if I write end? You can see that the mouse and the gap is at the same position. The only thing that changed is the letter. Letter has moved at the very bottom from the very top. What happens if I write center? Let's see. You can see that the text is at the center and the stretch will stretch the whole thing. Like this. I hope you understand align items. Now let's discuss about the align content. Align content will move all of these boxes along the y-axis inside our grid container. Let me show you. Over here you write align content. Let's start with start. And nothing's gonna happen. That's because it's the start position. You write end. You can see that our boxes has moved from the very top to the very bottom. What happens if you write center? You can see that it has moved to the center. Other than these 4 values over here, for align content, we have 3 more values, which is space between, space around, and space evenly. I have beautifully explained them on the cheat sheet using illustrations. Definitely go and check it out. In order to use them, you simply write space between over here, like this, and it's gonna work. Now let's discuss about the place items, which is a shorthand for justify items and align items. Now on CodePen, let's remove this, okay, and write justify items, okay, just for demonstration purposes, and align items over here, okay. Now I'm gonna put my mouse cursor at the very center over here, okay. Now see what happens. Over here I'm gonna write center. Okay, and at the same time I'm gonna write center over here as well. You can see that our text is at the very center. If you want to write it in the shortcut way, you're gonna write place items. Okay, you give center as the value. And now we can safely remove these 2 properties over here, and it's still gonna work perfectly fine. But if you want to use start, you can definitely do it by writing start over here, and you can see that it's working perfectly fine. If you want to go for end, it's gonna work. If you want to go for stretch, it's still gonna work. I hope you understand place items. Place content is basically the same thing. It's a shorthand for justify content and align content. Let's discuss about it. So let's remove this one over here and let's write justify content, which works on the x-axis. Let's say space between, okay, space between. You can see that we have a huge gap between our columns over here. Let's give a huge gap between our rows as well. In order to do that, you write align content like this, and write align content over here, and you write space between as well. Now you can see that our 4 boxes are at the 4 corners of our grid container. In order to do it in a shortcut way, let's write place content center, space between. And now we can remove these 2 properties like this, and it's still working perfectly fine. I hope you understand place content. Now we're going to discuss about the children properties. Let's start with grid column, start by end. Back to the cheat sheet, if you click this over here, then if you scroll up, you're going to find this chart over here, which is the grid scale. I told you earlier that like Microsoft spreadsheet, you can combine multiple columns together. At the same time, you can also combine multiple rows together. This is basically the scale, how we can do it. Over here, this is the column 1, column 2 and column 3. Okay, this is the row 1, row 2 and row 3. If you scroll down, you can see that this is the start of the column, which is column start, and then the column ends over here. This is column start for the column 2, and this is the column end. Same case for the row start, row end over here. The row starts here and ends over here. Scroll to the top, and here are some numbers. 1, which is this one, then 2, 3 and then 4 over here. This scale is actually used when you are trying to combine multiple rows and columns together. Now the default value for the grid column start is 1 and the default value of grid column end is 2. Let me show it on you on CodePen. Now back to the CodePen. Let's make a 2 by 2 grid, which is 2 columns, 2 rows. So keep the code as it is, don't change anything, and just come over to the HTML and create another box, which is box 4 like this, and over here write D. Come back over here on the container, we write display grid height 100 VH and then grid gap 20 pixels. In order to make the 2 by 2 grid layout, you write grid template columns, and then over here you write repeat 2, and let's set each column to 100 pixels, and then write grid template rows to repeat to 100 pixels each. But I also showed you the shortcut way of writing grid template rows and columns. You write just grid template like this, and you're gonna first cut this from here, Ctrl X, Ctrl V, and then you're gonna put a slash, and then you're gonna input the grid template columns. Cut this, Ctrl X, Ctrl V over here, and you delete this code, and we're basically done with just one single line of code. We have achieved our result. It looks pretty much the same. Wait, I actually changed my mind. Instead of using a 2 by 2 grid layout, let's use a 12 by 12 grid layout so that I can better make you understand. Okay, so come over here, instead of the 2, write 12. Okay, and same thing over here, you write 12, and instead of the 100 pixels, write 1 FR, which is 1 fraction. Okay, 1 FR. Same goes for here, 1 FR. Alright, now let's say that we want A to expand from the left to the very right, which is it's gonna cover 12 columns. In order to do that, first remember that grid column start and the grid column end are different properties, and they are children properties. Okay, so over here you write dot box1 curly braces, same for box 2, 3 and 4. Alright then, let's start experimenting with box 1. So over here, we're gonna write grid column start. The default value is 1, and the default value of grid column end is 2. Now the shortcut way of writing these two properties is grid column. Let me show you. Grid column, and the first input is the start and the next input is the end. They are separated by a slash like this, 1 by 2. So this is the default value for A. You can see that nothing has changed, but if you want to expand, let's say you want to take it to 100%, which is 12 columns. In order to do that, instead of 2 over here, you're gonna write 12. It's not gonna work. That's because we have to remove this. Okay, just comment this out and let's see. Now you can see that A has expanded from here to here, but not fully. Why is that? That's because you actually have to add another extra 1 on the 12, which is, if you do 13 over here, then you can see that we have A to expand 100%. Now, what's the theory behind this? Back to the cheat sheet, the default value is 1 over here and 2 over here. If you want to combine two columns together, then you actually have to add another 1 like this. So 1 over here, 2 and then 3. So our grid column will be 1 by 3. I will explain span, don't worry. And then if you want to combine everything, we have how many columns? 1, 2, 3, which means we have to add 1 more. Now the grid column will be 1/4, which is 1 over here and 4 over here. I hope you understand it. Simply put this in your mind that when you're trying to combine columns together, just add 1 at the last, like this one over here. So in order to expand 12 columns together, we have added 1. So 12 plus 1 equal to 13. So instead of writing this, you can also write the shortcut, which is this one, the grid column. Okay, so over here, if you write 12, then it's just gonna expand 11 columns. In order to expand 100%, you have to write 13 by adding 1, like this. Now it has expanded 100%. Now how can we achieve the same result using span? By using span, you don't have to change anything. You don't have to add anything. You just simply tell grid how many columns to join. For instance, if you want to join 5 columns together, over here you write span 5. And it's gonna add exactly 5 columns together. Now let's experiment with 12 columns. Replace 5 with 12. And you can see that it has expanded 100%. So I guess that using span is better than using the regular numbers. Where you might get confused or you might make some mistake, go for the span instead. I hope you understand the grid column start and end. The grid row start and end are pretty much the same thing as the grid column. And the same principle applies for the grid row as well, just like the grid column start end. The difference is the grid column works on the x-axis and this one works from the y-axis. So basically we don't have to remove anything, we just remove this line of code over here. But if you want to keep it, it's up to you. In order to use the grid row start and end, we write grid row start and then grid row end, like this. Okay. Now if you want A, which is the box one, to expand from the top to the very bottom, simply write over here 1, which is the starting point, and then over here we have to write 13, which is 12 plus 1. Basically we have 12 rows. And if you want to expand everything, or if you want to expand just 5, or if you want to expand just 4 rows, you still have to add 1, like this, 13. See, it has expanded 100%. Like that, the shortcut for this is grid row, and the first input is the start value 1, and then you put a slash, write 13, and remove these 2 lines of code. You can see that it gave us the same result like the previous one. The span also works the same as the grid column, right? Span 12. It's working exactly the same, no difference, no change. I hope you understand the grid column start by end and the grid row start by end. Now let's discuss about the justify self, align cells and its shorthand called the place self. Alright then, just remove this one over here. And instead of the 12 by 12 layout, we're going to use the 2 by 2 layout, which is 2 columns, 2 rows. The 12 by 12 means 12 columns and 12 rows. Alright? So over here, write 2 and 2 over here. And let's increase the gap a little bit, okay? So write 5 over here, which is 25 pixels, so that you can better see what I'm trying to do while I keep my mouse at the very center over here. If you can recall these two properties, which is justify items, justify content over here, it is pretty much the same as the justify self, but the main difference is these two works for the parent properties and the justify self, which is this one, works for the children properties. Let me show you. So we don't write justify self inside the container, we write justify self on the children properties. Okay, we write it inside the box 1, 2, 3 or 4. Like this, we write justify self, S-E-L-F, like this. Okay, are you seeing my mouse pointer? I'm gonna keep it at here, okay, at this center. So this is 25 pixels gap, and over here I have placed my mouse. Now see what happens if I set justify self to start. By the way, justify self works on the x-axis, okay? You write start like this. You can see that my mouse is at the same position, it hasn't moved. The only thing that moved is a letter. It went to the very left. But what happens if I write end, like this, E-N-D. Now you can see that the mouse is at the same position, but the letter has changed its position from the left to the right. Now let's experiment with center. You can see this one, and if I write stretch, you can see this result over here. I hope you understand justify self. Now remove the stretch and write center. Alright, you can see that only A has changed. B, C, D hasn't changed. That's because justify self is used to target one individual grid children. But if you use justify content and justify items, which are the parent properties, you can pretty much style all of these boxes together. If you are confused, then you can go to the point where I have discussed justify content, justify self. Timestamps are given on the description down below, so that you can go to that point very fast. Alright, let's discuss align self. Back to our CodePen editor, we remove this line of code over here and write align self. Okay. Now I'm gonna put my mouse pointer at here. Okay. By the way, the align self property works on the y-axis. Justify self works on the x-axis. Align self works on the y-axis. Alright, so over here, let's see what happens if I write start. My mouse pointer hasn't changed. The only thing that changed is the letter. It went to the very top. Let's experiment with end. You can see that the letter has come to the bottom. My mouse is at the same position. Let's experiment with center. You can see that result, and let's try with stretch. I hope you understand the difference between align self, justify self. Now let's discuss place self, which is a shorthand for justify self, align self. These two properties over here at the top, okay? In order to use place self, we simply write place self over here at the grid children. Let's start with just start. You can see that it has gone to the corner, okay? In order to recreate this using justify self and align self, we write justify self start and align self start as well. If you comment this out, then you can see that we have pretty much the same result. What if you want to place this letter at the very corner over here? In order to do that, you write over here end. The same thing over here as well, end. Now you can see that. But if you want to do it in a shortcut way by using place self, what you do is you just remove these two lines of code and uncomment this, and from start you write end. Like this, and we have got the same result. Alright boys, we're done with our tutorial. In the next video, I'm going to discuss everything you need to know about CSS Flexbox. If you like the video, give a like, share it with a friend, and feel free to subscribe. Till then, take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.